Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Virginia Trioli and I'm back, here to answer your questions tonight. The International Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, the Minister for Communications and the Arts, Mitch, Fifield, the singer-songwriter with something to say, Missy Higgins, long-time Liberal Party strategist and former Chief of Staff to John Howard, Grahame, and Labor Party frontbencher, Amanda Rishworth. Please welcome our panel tonight. Now, I know that last week I promised that Tony Jones would be here, but over the weekend, the laryngitis has kicked in, so he's watching quietly at home. Tony, dear one, please get well soon. We all want it. Tonight's Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV and live on iView and News Radio at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time. And you can stream us on YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. Our first question tonight comes from Amelia Gilbert.
Mitch, Fifield. Recent world events involving Facebook have exposed the serious implications that technology and the internet can have for individual privacy and democracy. It's clear that our current legal framework is insufficient in this area. With an election coming up next year, what steps is your government taking to address these shortcomings in privacy protection?
Thanks. It's a terrific question. I think if you look back over the last 10 years or so, there's been a bit of an attitude in general that somehow the ordinary laws of our society, the ordinary rules of human interaction don't apply online. Increasingly, the view of governments and the community is that the online space should be governed just like the real world, if you like. We're all very concerned about what's happened with Facebook. The Privacy Commissioner has announced that she's undertaking a formal inquiry to determine if Australian privacy law has been breached, and if it has, there are significant penalties. I've also, separate to that, commissioned the ACCC, the consumer watchdog, to undertake an inquiry into the market power of social media organisations to see how they use their data, what it is that they do when it comes to the presentation of news, what the influence is that they have over advertising. So I think we'll find some really important findings from those two inquiries. But my view is absolutely, if the laws aren't adequate, if the penalties aren't severe enough, then we should absolutely take further action.
Ken Roth, let's hear from you.
Look, we know the laws aren't adequate. We know that, companies like Facebook take our data. There's a little box you may check at the beginning filled with legal gobbledygook. You have no idea what it means. You don't really have a choice. We need to change the laws to give you control over your data. And so you should be able to decide, do you want to share the data or not? Do you want to take the data back? Do you want to take things off of Facebook, which is very hard to do? This, all is permitted within existing law. So we need laws that really protect our privacy. The other thing that's worth mentioning here is that the Australian government has taken the lead in trying to weaken privacy protections, because one of the best ways to protect your privacy when you're just speaking on the phone is with what's known as end-to-end encryption, so that nobody can snoop on your phone conversation, nobody can snoop on your email. The Australian government wants to, what they call, build a back door into end-to-end encryption. And the result would be, basically, it's weakening end encryption. It's not just the government that'll snoop, it's hackers, it's bad guys, it's the Chinese and Russian government. And so this is a crazy idea. You can't, weaken end-to-end encryption, weaken our privacy protections for just, law enforcement purposes without weakening your privacy protections for everything you do. We don't want to go there.
I want to hear from everyone on the panel on this, but just very briefly, I see you saying that's not true. Very briefly, what's your argument in response?
Well, we're not looking for a back door into people's encrypted communications. What we want to do is what I said before, is that the ordinary rules of the land, the ordinary laws of the land apply in the online space. Now, if police have concern that someone is going to undertake an illegal activity, then they can seek a warrant, they can seek a phone tap to try and intercept a phone message. It shouldn't be any different if you're talking about a different sort of technology.
Sure, but I think Ken Roth is talking on a specific change that you're referencing.
Yeah. In other words, of course, the police can always seek a warrant. And if you go to a company that allows end-to-end encryption, their answer will be, we can't get in there. End-to-end encryption means we don't have access to that communication. What the government wants to do is to change that. They want to make it so when you seek a warrant, the company says, oh yeah, we can just use our little special on-the-side technique to get in there. That's a backdoor. They don't like to use the term backdoor. They want to weaken our privacy protections. And it's not going to be just for law enforcement. It's going to be for every bad guy who wants your data.
Well, look, Amanda Rishworth might have something to say on this a little later on, but let's go around the panel still in response to your first question there, Amelia. Missy Higgins.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because things like Facebook are so useful in our everyday lives. I mean, in my personal life, I use Facebook to ask questions to my friends. Like recently I asked my friends, how do I get my 3-year-old to stop pissing in his pants and go in the toilet instead? And I got a lot of really helpful answers.
The internet has pages devoted to those particular questions.
It really does. And then obviously I use it with my work to promote my music. So it has been really helpful. And I don't mind if a bit of my data is used to sell things back to me. I'm constantly getting ads about, I don't know, holidays to Bali and pregnancy and marriage and weight loss and things that they think that I would be interested in. But it's when my data is being used against me as propaganda to potentially sway an election. That's when I think that it's time for the government to step in.
Grahame Morris?
I declare an interest. One of my clients is Apple, and they're really, really anxious and toey about anything to do with encryption. All your phones there, each month, each 6 months, they're updated, and the security for those gets greater and greater and greater. There is a fear among many of the big communication people that the government will do something, and the Americans and the Brits and whatnot, which will weaken that. And the only way you can break encryption, Apple can't do it, nobody can do it at the moment, is that you put a little key in there so that Apple or somebody can do it and the police can ask for it. But the minute you build in that backdoor key, every lunatic in the world is going to be trying to get the Apple key, and your privacy will be stuffed.
This is Ken's concern.
It is.
Yeah.
But apart from that, this is a slightly different audience, but I think it really is time that we started talking to some of the young kids and just saying, look, this stuff, you're jumping up and down about privacy, but have a look at the stuff you and your kids are putting out there for everyone else, and it scares the hell out of you. People just taking selfies of themselves in their underwear just to see what they look like, and then sending it to their mates. That gets sent somewhere else, and then we bitch about privacy.
Can I just quickly, before we move on to... I think some people have made their choices about that, clearly. Before we get to you, Amanda Rishworth, as a political operative, would using someone like, or an organisation like Cambridge Analytica have bothered you? That's for you, Grahame.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, I honestly think what the Minister was saying is right. I think that sort of stuff has gone way, way, way too far.
It would not have occurred to you at the time?
No, I'm really annoyed it didn't.
OK, so you wouldn't have had qualms about
it is a wonderful, wonderful tool for a political operative, but it goes too far, way too far.
OK. Amanda Rishworth.
Well, look, thank you for the question. I think we were all really shocked when we heard this week that not only was your information that you put up onto Facebook available, but also if you did a personality quiz by a third-party app, that not only the information you put in there, but got transmitted to a third party, but everything on Facebook. I think this week was really a threshold issue for Facebook, and I think it became clear to Congress and indeed Mark Zuckerberg himself that that regulation is needed in this space. Now, what that looks like, how you enforce it, is, I think, a really difficult question, and I'm very keen for the Privacy Commissioner to see that report. But I think it became clear this week that Facebook was dragged kicking and screaming to the table to admit or to catch up with what had gone wrong, and it didn't meet community standards. I would say, though, on another element of what can we do, we need to be educating our children from a very young age about what information literacy is and what digital literacy is. Not just to question what they're seeing, but to question what they're not seeing. When I was at high school, I learned about primary sources and secondary sources. You make sure you go to the primary source book, not the secondary source book. We are in a new world now. Is this information we're getting correct? Is it not correct? And how is that manipulating me? We need a critical citizen to be constantly thinking about it, and we need to start that at school and the early years as well.
Can I just quickly ask you, before we move on, whether you're as concerned as Ken is about any backdoor, so to speak, changes?
Well, look, we've got to have the tools, and our security agents have to have the tools to do what they need to do, and that was certainly the context in which the government proposed these changes. Obviously, you've got to monitor these changes and make sure that they do not impinge on our privacy, but certainly we've also got to take stock of government agencies and security agencies about what they need. But there does need to be, obviously, oversight on this type of ability and technology.
All right, we'll move on to our next question, and it comes from Pete Johnson.
Hi, Minister. Australia's 51st in the world today for internet speed. Anyone could have predicted that mobile technology would inevitably supersede fixed broadband, and that a government-owned wholesale monopoly would become an uncompetitive and inefficient dinosaur. Utilities only ever raise prices, and when it's sold, a privatised NBN will be a licence to extract monopoly rent from its captive customers. Surely the right broadband approach was the original plan of John Howard: unfettered urban competition and a universal service obligation for remote and rural areas. What was ever so difficult about that?
Well, to quote Cher, if I could turn back time, but that isn't open to a politician. You have to deal with what it is that you inherit. And you're quite right. Having a government-owned monopoly was not our policy. It was the one of my predecessor, Stephen Conroy. But we're going to make the best of what we have. You did mention Australia being 51st in the world in terms of internet speeds. I've got some good news for you. It's not actually the case, because those particular surveys don't measure the technical capability of a network. They measure the speeds that someone is getting, and what primarily drives the speeds that someone is getting is the speed package that they purchase from their retail service provider. Also, that particular survey is measuring fundamentally the pre-NBN network, because most people have yet to switch to the NBN. Where we are today is the NBN is now available to more than half the nation. It'll be completed by 2020, which is a good 6 to 8 years sooner than would have been the case under our predecessors, and at $30 billion less cost. Now, it's not our intention to keep the NBN in government hands. It is to sell it to the private sector. That also was the position of our predecessors. Exactly how we will do that will be determined once we have a Productivity Commission inquiry, once we've completed the rollout. But our overwhelming focus at the moment is to complete the rollout by 2020, and we're on track.
Now, the internet right now is absolutely melting down, and any mention of the NBN, the costs, the speeds, how this has gone, how it should have gone, and I can feel us all going down that rabbit hole immediately. So, you know, my thoughts are with everyone on Twitter this evening as they're trying to cope with this. But Amanda Rishworth, I can see that you're straining to respond to this as well, so go ahead.
Well, firstly, to the questioner, I think it's not right to say that John Howard's plan was delivering. In my electorate, I was elected in 2007, and it was the #1 issue that was brought up. People could not get connected. The previous Howard government had tried 20 different programs to try and make it work, and that is why Labor built the network. Now, we didn't want to see a copper network. Copper is old-style technology. It's not something that future-proof. So it's not surprising that we see 5G being a competitive reality with NBN, the failed NBN copper network. But that's why we've got to get more fibre in the ground, because the truth of it is a 5G network will not be able to sustain our internet needs for the long run. Fibre to the home, the premise, the curb, as much fibre as you can get onto the ground. And it is disappointing. I think that the government, who promised this would be finished in 2016, promised 25 megabits. It's just failing. The multi-mix technology has failed. A proper fibre network would have done the job for Australia, would have future-proofed us into the future, because mobile relies on fibre as well. The two are complementary, and I believe they could have been complementary. Now it's up to the government to really, and I've welcomed them changing their policy to go to fibre to the curb in some places, but what about all the people that have missed out, that have got copper to the node, and there is now a digital divide? It is really, really concerning, and I think it's a huge missed opportunity that Australia missed by not building that network.
I'm just going to pause both of you, because as I said before, when we get to this topic, it's always just this endless, no, your fault, no, your fault, no, your fault, which just drives everyone totally bonkers. Missy Higgins, but you're part of a younger generation and people who rely on a network like this all the time. What do you want? What do you want to see, and what do you think Australia would be prepared to pay to build?
Look, I mean, I think I share a lot of Australians' opinion in saying that the NBN has been a bit of a big fat disappointment. I mean, obviously the internet at our house cuts out regularly, and when I was recently writing my new album, I did a lot of it via the internet, with collaborating with people overseas and interstate, and so I was uploading really big files and trying to download really big files, and that was a huge hindrance to that process. But they're kind of first world problems compared to all the regional people in Australia who are using or trying to use the internet for a lifeline, sometimes literally. They use it for education, they use it for medical purposes. I mean, a regional doctor might be trying to get in contact with a city hospital and not be able to. So in some cases, it is a matter of life and death.
Okay, let's move on to our next question now, and it comes from Hayley Pollock.
My question is for Ken Roth. Donald Trump's recent mission accomplished tweet was quite a bold statement. You've been known to say that the slaughtering of Syrian civilians won't stop until President Assad is put in jail. In the meantime, there's quite a lot of uncertainty around what's going to happen. What would you say to people like me who are feeling quite unsettled and afraid of what repercussions we're going to have with Australia's involvement?
Well, you're completely right to be worried. I mean, the problem in Syria is that the Assad government, backed by Putin as well as Iran, has chosen to fight this war, not the way the Geneva Conventions prescribe. That is, not by targeting combatants, but actually by targeting the civilians who happen to live in the areas held by the armed opposition. And that's why we have 5 million plus Syrian refugees. That's why another 6 million are displaced within the country. It's not safe. If you're living in opposition areas, you get bombed, you get besieged. If the government gets its hands on you, you get detained, tortured, and possibly executed. Now, Trump's missile barrage addressed a tiny little way that the Assad government kills people. I don't know what chemical weapons deaths are probably 1%, if that. Most of the time he uses conventional weapons. And it seems that this mission that was accomplished is, to send a signal, at least to the folks back home, that Trump is not Obama. He's not going to do nothing. He's going to do a missile barrage when chemical weapons are used. In the meantime, the way Putin and Assad kill civilians is mainly with conventional bombs, and effectively they have a green light to continue. So, what can we do to stop that? One thing obviously is to build up the prospect of prosecution. And fortunately there now is a Syria prosecutor, but Russia keeps vetoing efforts to send Syria to the International Criminal Court. The other key thing is pressure on Putin. Assad is, in a sense, beyond shaming, he's beyond redemption. But Putin still cares about his reputation, he cares about his economy, and that's why it's absolutely essential to ratchet up the pressure on Putin. And slowly people are moving in that direction, but I think far too slowly. We have the World Cup coming up. I hope nobody attends the opening ceremonies. That Putin wants this to be, his big celebration, following a supposed re-election, although it's really just a selection process. That's an opportunity to say, we're not going to go, join your party when you are underwriting mass murder in Syria. That's one of the least things that the international community can do.
Tell us a bit more about the pressure, though, that you would like to see put on Russia.
Well, I think that there clearly is economic pressure that's beginning. We saw, interestingly, while no economic pressure is put on responding to, the massive slaughter in Syria, you get one assassination attempt using nerve agents in the UK, and suddenly the oligarchs are targeted for economic sanctions. Now, he cares about the oligarchs. This is where he parks his money. These are the people who are running the economy. These are his critical partners in his repressive apparatus. So that's something that is beginning to hurt. There clearly are other both reputational and political steps that the West can take to make clear that Putin has now moved beyond the pale. And I think that that's the only way that we're going to rein in Assad.
Mitch Fifield, do you believe there's an appetite for that? I mean, they will be very significant and potentially dangerous steps to take those big steps of pressure against a figure like Vladimir Putin. Is there an appetite for that in the West, and is there an appetite here in Australia for that?
Well, the first point to recognise is, and I think Ken's right, that Russia, if they chose to be, could be a positive force. They could have an influence over the Syrian regime. They have tremendous influence. But what we've seen every time we bring resolutions to the United Nations is Russia vetoes them. We want to try and use those multilateral forums, but Russia, through its use of a veto, has restricted those opportunities, which is why you have seen the United States and the UK and France take the targeted and proportional action that they have.
Hayley's question, though, went to the disquiet and the anxiety that we might feel here in Australia, particularly given any Australian involvement. What's your response to Hayley about that?
Well, Australia's involvement in Syria has been focused on ISIL, making sure that we can contain and eliminate and degrade that poisonous organisation, and there's been quite a degree of success there. Ultimately, in Syria, what we all want to see is a political solution of some sort. It can be hard to direct political solutions in a kinetic way, but on occasion, you've got to say, there's certain activities being undertaken by the regime which cannot go without a response.
I think, Hayley, you wanted to follow up if we could, if we're able to somehow get a... no, Hayley, we can't hear you unless we get a microphone to you, but we don't have one near you at the moment. So let's try and bring one to you and then go right ahead now. Yeah, go.
Thank you for your responses. I appreciate the complexity of this issue, and I know that I certainly don't have the specialised knowledge to sort of weigh in on the politics of it. I think the question that I'm more asking the panel is, how does someone who is just a regular Australian citizen manage those anxieties? I know for me personally it's terrifying to think that Australia could become involved and that we could have some sort of retaliation. And it's more a question of how can we manage those anxieties as a country, because people are really struggling from a mental health point of view with this insane fear.
Hayley, are you talking about fear of perhaps some sort of terrorist reprisal?
Fear of an attack, or fear of the repercussions that could happen if we got involved and we backed the US, or if something happened and all of a sudden the Syrian regime turned on us.
Well, we weren't, of course, involved in this particular recent strike, but as the Minister said, we are involved there. Grahame Morris, I'll get you to respond to Hayley's question.
Well, I think everyone in the audience and all those listening are also uneasy about where this is going to go. If you come back one, I think anyone who uses chemical weapons, they ought to start war crime proceedings straight away. I just don't think anybody nowadays can live with that, hence the strike. Was that strike meant to solve the Syrian problem? No, not at all. It was meant to be a reaction to a mongrel act, and that's happened. I think where we're all uneasy now is we're not quite sure what the Russians will do. And it's hard to think what they can do. You know, they can go back to the Security Council, all that sort of, that's predictable. It's hard to see how they can retaliate in a sensible, restricted way. The real problem is, what if that regime does it again? Then I think the Americans will get bigger and harder. The French are in there, the Brits are in there, and I think a lot of others will be. And then the Russian reaction is going to be terribly unpredictable. I think we're lucky in this, we live in this part of the world. The unease, I understand, and I think most Australians would share it.
It's always a question that confronts us, Minister, whenever we are involved in an overseas and conflict venture like this, what the reprisal might be. Are you, is the government concerned that there might be some consequence in Australia for our involvement so far?
Well, I think as a government, you've always got to take a principled approach when it comes to military engagement, just speaking in general, that if there's a wrong that you think needs a response, then you should follow through. If there are people who are being oppressed, who need support, then that should be given. The sorts of opportunities which we might face in terms of reprisals, the people who would give effect to those often have an issue with our way of life and our values anyway, and they don't need the excuse of us being involved beyond our shores to seek to make us a target. So I think we've got to keep those things separate. If there's something that needs doing, we should do it. If we are going to be a target, well, chances are we would have been anyway.
Thanks, Minister. Next question now comes from Ahmed Zafar Iqbal.
Right, hi. So my question is from the panel in general and to Ken Roth in particular. So in light of the recent Syrian war and the retaliation by France, the United Kingdom and America, it's very possible, and I feel likely, that the refugee crisis will be exacerbated. How do you feel about, given the fact that Australia is now on the United Nations Human Rights Council for the first time, do you think Australia should be taking in more refugees and granting a safe haven to more refugees? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. And it's good that you bring up the refugees, because the irony here is that it's much easier to bomb Syria in response to Assad's atrocities than it is to welcome in the refugees who are fleeing those atrocities. And we should do the hard thing. We should really open all of our doors. And I say this not just about Australia, but every wealthy government that has the means should be bringing in far more refugees. If you look right now, the countries in the region, Lebanon today is 25% Syrian refugees. A country of 4 million that has basically 1 million refugees. Turkey has 3.5 million refugees. Jordan has another 1 million or so. I mean, these are not the poorest of countries, but they're not as wealthy as the West, and they're carrying an enormous burden. The least we can do, fortunate enough to live in more advanced countries, is to take in more refugees, and not just to take in the Christians. What is that message? But to take in anybody in need without regard to their religion. So I'm all for it.
I'll come to you, Nathan. We'll hear from all the panel on this. But Missy Higgins, I wanted to go to you because you've actually written a song that comes from the Syrian refugee crisis.
Yeah, I wrote a song called "Oh Canada," which was about or inspired by the photo that was doing the rounds of the world media of Alan Kurdi, who was a 3-year-old Syrian boy who was fleeing his country with his family in order to try and find a safe place to live. And most of us know the story. The boat capsized, and the only person surviving from that family was his father, Abdullah Kurdi. And like most people that saw that photo of this 3-year-old boy washed up on a beach in Turkey, I was absolutely devastated because it put a human face to the crisis, And I think that a lot of the time, so many of us are so removed from it, and especially with this rhetoric that comes out of the government, calling these people criminals, calling them, even the word asylum seekers has a stigma now. So they come to our shores, or they try to reach our shores, and if they get anywhere close, we lock them up in these detention centres that are like prisons, in fact, probably worse than prisons, because these people are indefinitely kept in a place where they're suffering hugely, they've had hugely traumatic experiences and have PTSD beyond belief. And my father actually volunteers at the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre in Melbourne, and he tells me the most devastating things. He saw a man the other day from Sudan who had scars around his ankle from being hung by his ankle and tortured. And he sees regularly patients that have scars all over their bodies from torture. And to think that we can allow these people who are only seeking a safe place to live, that's all they wanted, that's all anybody wants is a safe place to live, to think that we treat them like criminals is just really appalling.
Amanda Rishworth?
Well, look, I think we can be more generous and we can accept more refugees. We have probably the most significant number of displaced people around the world. And I do agree with Ken, it needs to be non-discriminatory. We need to see every individual based on their circumstance, their fact, the persecution that they have been fleeing from. I think it's also important, and it goes to the question that was asked before, we cannot work as a country in isolation though. We have to also work through multilateral agencies, whether that's the UNHCR when it comes to refugees, whether that's the United Nations. While at times, some of those institutions can be not perfect. I think it's really important that as a global citizen, not only do we do our bit, but we also participate, we fund, we support those institutions. And that includes aid. That's aid around the world. We can do better in humanitarian assistance and aid around the world. And yes, there'll be a lot of people leaving Syria, but there'll be also people on the ground that need our support and help as well.
Just before I go to the Minister, is there a figure that the opposition is considering in terms of how we would increase our refugee intake in order to take account of the situation in Syria?
Well, not directly in relation to Syria, but our policy at the last election was to increase it to 27,000 new, refugee.
But I did mean whether there was a specific focus and specific thought process around Syrian refugees.
Well, not about Syrian refugees, but I think if we look across the world, we're seeing not just Syria, that's obviously very topical today, but we are seeing humanitarian crisis in many places around the world, and we can be more generous.
Can I maybe just...
Can I just go? I will come back to you, but let me just hear from the Minister, because the question, I will come back to you as well, Grahame, but the question was whether Australia should be granting more refugees a safe haven in Australia because of the reality of the situation. Do you think that we should?
Well, Australia consistently has the second or third most generous humanitarian intake of any country in the world. And that's been something that's been the case, whether it be a coalition government or a Labor government. And I think Australians are very comfortable about that. We also, as you would know, had that additional Syrian intake as well, which is well underway.
But we don't, just to jump in there, that's not complete, is it? That's coming in quite slowly, it seems.
Oh, it's coming in steadily.
But when, I think it was about 12,000, I think, forgive me if I got the figure wrong. How long will it take until they're all in the country?
Yeah, I can't give you that figure.
The reason I know that we're well more slowly than people expect or hope.
Yeah, no, I think we're well underway to meeting that undertaking that we gave. I don't think that there's any inconsistency, just picking up on Missy's point, between being generous when it comes to the humanitarian intake on the one hand, but also making sure that we have secure borders and that we have policies that are not an encouragement to people smugglers to ply their trade, because we know when they do ply their trade and they do prey upon vulnerable people, what we see are significant deaths at sea, and none of us want that to occur.
People smugglers are not the problem. I mean, these people that you talk about, people talk about jumping the queue, but there is no queue when you're so desperate that you would risk putting your family on a rickety boat to go to an unknown country where you have no guarantee of actually finding a safe haven. If you're that desperate...
Grahame Morris, I know you've got something to add here, so go ahead.
I'm going to be the odd one out. I'm getting a bit sick of people like Ken, people from overseas giving us curry about what we should do about refugees, about migrants and about our borders. You know, we got 190,000 people come here each year, migrants. There are hundreds of thousands of others who queue up, do the right thing, get processed, who want to come here. And you know, we're getting lectures from people overseas saying, hey, you've got to do more. Well, You know, this is that some people are less, that people who queue and do the right thing are somehow or other less worthy than people who turn up elsewhere and come in through the back door.
Missy, I'm going to give it to Ken, but very briefly if I can, Ken.
All right. I mean, 2 points. One, people who queue, who are regular migrants, are one thing. People who are facing death and persecution don't have the option to queue. They got to get out. Now, if Australia were serious about trying to save lives at sea, it would set up a processing center in Indonesia, so nobody would have to get on a boat. They could be processed there. Now, in terms of the last point, in terms of generosity, very quick, let me compare it with Canada. We're talking about 12,000. I don't know how long it's taken to get this 12,000. Justin Trudeau said, as an emergency measure, we're going to tack 25,000 on just for our Syrian refugee intake. It took 3 months. At the end of that 3 months, because Canada has this private placement program, and people were lining up for their private placement, and they started complaining, where's my refugee? You ran out of refugees. And so they increased it to 40,000 in just a matter of months.
Okay.
Yeah, but look...
I'm going to leave it there because time is tight and I want to hear from some other questioners tonight. So let's go to a video question. And that video question comes from Carl Myers, who's the president of Deaf Australia. His question is in Australian Sign Language, Auslan, but I'll read a summary of it so our vision impaired viewers can understand it as well. Carl's concerned about the government's plans for the National Relay Service, which helps deaf people use the phone system. Have a look. So in our consultation with you and your department, we have repeatedly been told there'll be no cuts to the National Relay Service. The current cost of the service is over $30 million per year, yet the tender has capped funding at just $22 million. With reduction of funds, how will you ensure that this tender results in a service that will truly meet our needs? And that question there comes from Kyle. Minister, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Virginia. Thanks, Kyle, for the question. We do have an important option for communication for people who are deaf or who have a hearing impairment or a speech impairment called the National Relay Service. It's something that has been in place for a long time. It used to be the only communications option for people in those particular circumstances. We now have a wide range of options. Many of those are free or at no cost by virtue of evolving technology. And what we're doing is we're putting to tender the National Relay Service. It has a budget of $22 million, which is what the budget has always been. And we want to make sure that we still have that as an option for people, particularly those people who have a hearing impairment, who wish to speak themselves. That's one of the things about the National Relay Service is just because you might be deaf, you can speak. The person at the other end of the line can hear you. They can then speak and a relay officer can then re-speak or type what you've said so that the person initiating the call who might be hearing impaired can see a text version of what's been said. It's an important service, and Kyle, rest assured, we will always make sure that it has the funds that it needs.
Just very quickly, because I do want to move on to other questions, but what the organisation is the most fearful of is that this world-class system that operates 24/7 might actually be cut back, that you might not get 24/7, all the hours in the day service. Can you reassure the community that won't happen?
Sure, absolutely. As a former Minister for Disabilities and Aged Care, I will always make sure in my portfolio with the National Relay Service that it provides what Australians need.
Okay, we've got a response from Kyle. He's just responded by SMS. I'll just read it out to you. The relay service users are relying on your pledge on national television that we will not be worse off as a result of this tender. So I'll just nail that down to the floor here. That's your pledge.
That's my pledge, Kyle.
Okay, good to hear. All right, let's go to our next question, and it comes from Alia Livore.
Missy Higgins, I think it's great that you use your platform as a musician to make some really powerful political statements. But at the same time, last week I found myself wishing another person with a platform, Israel Folau, would stick to football and not make social comments when he posted that gay people would go to hell. What role should celebrities have in influencing social and political issues, and how can we engage without being hypocritical?
Look, I think if you have a public platform, you have you've been given a gift, and I don't necessarily think it's our responsibility to talk up about issues or to be vocal on certain issues, but I think that it is an incredible opportunity, and if we feel passionately about something, I think that it's just as much our right as it is anybody's right to speak our mind and for our opinions to be heard. It can be hard sometimes because in this climate, you say one thing and you get 100,000 people barraging you with insults online, and so you're definitely making yourself more and more vulnerable. But I think art should be a form of self-expression, and I don't think that we should ever have to self-censor ourselves. I think that...
And that includes Israel Folau and his views?
Look, I'm not going to go there.
But it's a good question.
Because,
it's a really good question about
is.
the complexity of that.
It is very
might not always be a view
complex.
that you like to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak so much for the sports culture because my field is art, and my thinking around art is that it should be a form of self-expression, and my songs are very much about me expressing something that I feel passionately about. And, I guarantee that probably somebody has already tweeted in, Missy should shut up and sing. Stick to singing or something like that.
More on that later. Spoiler alert. Look, let's go to our next question.
Obviously, it's already happened.
No, the singing I meant.
Oh, okay.
But there you go, now we really have spoiled it. Okay, this question might include a few more people and just broadens it out a little bit. It comes from Brian Pearson.
Yes, my question to the panel is, whilst it's good to focus on human rights abroad, I'd like to point out that there were 16,000 submissions to Philip Ruddock's Religious Freedom Review, one of which was my own. So there's obviously great concern in our own society for things like religious freedom and freedom of speech. And I'd just like to know what specific laws the panel could recommend that we should pass in Australia so that people don't feel threatened when they have a religiously held conviction or a particular point of view.
Well, Grahame Morris, let's start with you.
We had a vote here which said that the gay community could marry. We did not have a vote that says everyone has to wake up in the morning, including footballers like Folau, and say, hey, it's a good idea to be gay. I think it was one of the problems with the plebiscite we had. We sort of, do you think gay people should marry? And most people would say yes to that. But then we'd say, we'll tell you what that means after the vote. And we are now having a couple of inquiries, one held by Philip Ruddock, as to what sort of people should be exempt from that. Now, you could understand the churches should be exempt. That should be a no-brainer. What about a country hall where the council is a little bit uncomfortable? What about, the silly ones that people raise, like the cake maker and whatnot? But here we are, after having a vote, we're now deciding what the vote should mean, and I just think that's a bizarre way of doing things. Luckily, a fellow like Philip Ruddock, who is a very, very decent man and a caring man, I think will get it right. But the electorate and the lawmakers will still have to act on this to make sure that people do have some freedom to express some views and to keep their personal views, whether religious or not, and so they should.
Brian, can I just come back to you and ask, do you at the moment feel like you are restrained in expressing yourself?
Yes, I think that last year really showed up that Christians were under pressure. The law was used against Julian Porteous in Tasmania. We had people blocked from going to meetings where there was just peaceful, law-abiding meetings. There was nothing particularly dramatic going to happen there, but there were militant people with they're entitled to their point of view, but they're not entitled to block people's right to have their say as well. And I think we need laws to really come down on those people hard so we continue to live in a society that respectfully handles difference of opinion.
Sure. Amanda Rishworth?
Well, look, I think we have good laws around human rights in this country. And I think the issue when it comes to rights, you're talking about the right to express your religion. But there's the right also to not be discriminated against. So no right is absolute. We live in a community and we live in a democracy where we do have the right to free speech, but we don't have the right to hate speech. So there are always going to be limitations on some rights because they are protecting other rights. And it's about getting the balance right, in my mind. We don't want a place where people can incite violence through hate speech. I don't want to live in that place, whether it's against Christians, whether it's against Muslims, whether it's against different races. So no right is absolute in and of itself. You have to look how it interacts with other rights. And the right to live free from discrimination is also another important right. So we've got to look at how these work together and ensure that people have the right to express themselves, but also have the right to feel safe and secure in the place where they live.
Ken Roth?
Yeah. I think it's important to understand that religious freedom is really, it's about personal beliefs. Nobody can tell you, what God to pray to, how you're going to pray, who you're going to get together with when you pray. Those are all kind of critical elements of freedom of religion. On the other hand, some people cite freedom of religion to justify mistreating others, and that's where you have to draw the line. And so, for example, when people say, I'm not going to bake a cake in my bakery for a gay couple, that's bigotry, that's discrimination, that's not freedom of religion. And it's important to make that clear. I mean, imagine if you said, in my bakery or my restaurant, I'm not going to serve Aboriginal people because my religion doesn't permit that. I'm not going to serve Jews. I'm not going to serve Muslims. You can imagine where this is going to go. So how we treat other people is a matter for discrimination laws and things of that sort. It's not a matter of our religious freedom, our personal beliefs.
And just before we move on, very quickly, we have the Ruddock Review coming down the line, but is there a sense that laws actually need to be changed, that the laws we have at the moment aren't sufficient?
Well, I think you always want to be very careful when you're seeking to legislate in this area, lest you create a problem that didn't previously exist, or lest in trying to fix a problem, you codify something that you don't want to be acceptable into being accepted. You've got to be very careful in this area. And I always think that the greatest protection for religious freedom is having a robust and pluralistic democracy where views can be debated openly, where people feel the freedom to put a view, but equally someone else has the freedom to challenge that view.
Okay, let's go to our next question now, and it comes from Kev Londorf.
Hi, in our new global economy, should the Western world be more concerned about technological and economic espionage from countries like China and Russia than previously? Thank you.
I think we'll start with you, Ken Roth, on that one, if we can.
Sure. Well, I mean, they obviously are engaging in that espionage. So, yes, you have to worry about that. I think probably a lot of people are doing it, but both the Russians and Chinese are pretty notorious for that. The question is, how do you stand up to it? How do you defend against it? There has been a tendency, particularly with China, to feel that it's such a big market that you just have to play along. And, we face this with human rights problems as well. Xi Jinping right now, the Chinese president, is, consolidating power, is probably the most repressive period in China since the Tiananmen Square massacre. But nonetheless, people are reluctant to speak out because China's a big market. And I think that this, industrial or technological espionage is happening much more so because of this unwillingness to stand up to Chinese misconduct.
Amanda Rishworth?
Well, look, there's currently some laws before the Parliament that the government has introduced around foreign interference, foreign donations, those sorts of things. From the opposition's perspective, we're looking very carefully at those. We think there's a bit of overreach where charities and journalists have been caught up. But ultimately, we've got to act in our national interest and look at what laws we can introduce to protect against foreign interference, whether that's in elections, whether that's political donations, whether that's espionage. I think it is a new challenge, a new era that we do face, and we've got to make sure that our laws, our security agencies, but also our institutions actually can stand up for our national interest and protect against this new phenomena around the world.
Grahame Morris, you've got a long political memory. Has the situation with China and its demonstrated interference, has it turned into something that surprises you? Could you, in your earlier years, see this coming down the line?
Well, the answer is not to the extent it has. But from the Prime Minister, the new Minister Taylor, our cybersecurity guy, Alistair McGibbon, they are seeing stuff that's really got them spooked.
And private enterprise sees that on a daily basis too.
There have been a number of would-be attacks on various government departments, various government agencies from outside, and it's really got them worried. And they are looking at ways as to how they tighten it. For example, if a foreign outfit did want to close down our communications network that we'd be talking about, they're getting blinking close to be able to do it. And they're trying to work out at the moment, how do we build some sort of cyber security wall around us, or at least intelligence, so that we can knock them over when it happens. But it's becoming prevalent, and it's got, from the Prime Minister down, it's got them worried.
Just very quickly, if you can, we have a sort of parallel question on this coming up next, which you might want to address too. Well,
I guess going back to the original question, we've always had human activity when it comes to espionage. Electronic means gives another avenue for espionage activity, but also we've got to be increasingly aware, as Grahame touched on, that we also have non-state actors who seek to disrupt using electronic means, using online platforms. So we need to be vigilant, not just about the traditional adversaries, but also those who have technology who aren't necessarily part of a state organisation.
Now, before we go to our next question, have you sent in your audition to join the Q&A People's Panel? Because these people have.
I have been an avid follower of Q&A ever since it started 10 years ago.
I watch it pretty much every week and I'm always boom, 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 boom on Twitter.
Being on the panel and representing everyday Australians and giving it to the politicians would be fun.
I'm capable of being able to look at an issue and acknowledge that most arguments are not black and white.
I'm not afraid to speak my mind.
People like me have been given platforms on mainstream media in countries like US and UK.
I'm young. I see a lot of people around me struggling with their careers, their finances.
I became involved with the Schools Gay Straight Alliance, and as part of that I actually flew to Melbourne to speak at the launch of the Safe Schools Coalition.
I'd love to discuss disability, but there's also a lot more to me than just that.
Now I live and work as a suicide prevention and mental health advocate.
I started off in a small factory town in country South Australia. That town's kind of dying at the moment.
I believe that young voters, such as myself, have a responsibility to take any opportunity we are given to engage in the political arena.
I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to seeing everyday Australians on the panel.
We have some great candidates, but we want more smart citizens to put up their hands for the People's Panel. So we
Is there an everyday moderator?
I don't know. We'll see. If Tony Jones is well enough, maybe he can fulfil that role. But we need men, women, Indigenous Australians, African Australians, Asian and European Australians. In short, we need everybody. So it doesn't matter where you're from, as long as you've got something to say. So go to our website to find out how to send in your video audition and join the Q&A People's Panel. May even be interested in you, Grahame, for that. Our next question comes from Liu Yifan.
As a Chinese student, I really care about the relationship between Australia and China. But the relationship now seems slightly tense. How does the Australian government tend to ease tensions with China?
It's the bookend question to our previous question. It's perfectly phrased. Thank you. Minister, we will start with you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Look, we have a really good relationship with China. As you know, it's an important trading partner. We have two-way trade of about $175 billion a year. And we have very close people-to-people links. We have good business relationships with China. But from time to time, in any mature bilateral relationship, there will be issues that emerge where the two governments have a different perspective. And what we have to do is just work those through with respect as they arise.
Amanda Rishworth?
Well, look, I don't think China would have a problem with us acting in our national interests. But I've been concerned about some of the rhetoric that has come from the government around the Bennelong by-election, for example, which did seem to inflame tensions within the Chinese Australian community. So, look, I and certainly Labor has been concerned about the way and the rhetoric that the government's been engaged in over the last little while.
Okay. Now there's time for one last question, and it comes from Matt Needham.
Missy Higgins, this evening you've been talking about issues and singing about issues too.
Oh, you need a microphone.
Sorry, Wes, we don't have a microphone to you. Sorry. Let's start again. There we go.
Missy Higgins. Yeah. This evening you've been talking about issues and you also sing about issues. Mm-hmm. Do you think the sung lyrics are more powerful than the spoken word, and therefore are you more influential than our politicians? Or should our politicians sing in Parliament?
I bloody wish.
I can't sing. So.
Just in case you didn't hear the last part of that question, Matt asked whether our politicians should sing in Parliament.
No.
Yeah, I know we'd like to hear that. Oh, God, it depends who's doing the singing and who's doing the talking, really, doesn't it? Like,
But is the sung phrase, maybe to your mind it is, but is the sung phrase more powerful than the spoken one?
I mean, I could listen to Obama speak for hours on end, and I think that would be much more powerful than Britney Spears singing "Ooh, baby, baby, hit me one more time." Then again,
I think it depends on the circumstances you're in. But
that's true. But you know. But this show's been going for, 55 minutes, and I'm about to sing a 4-minute song, so we can see how this show has prioritised things this evening.
Oh, she got me.
We'll let the audience make up their own mind on that one.
Ken, singing versus speaking. Oh, can you sing, by the way?
No, and I'm not even going to attempt this.
Excellent.
So I know my place.
But which is more powerful?
But I very much believe in celebrities using their platform to speak out. And obviously, it's not always for a good cause. But overall, I think it's a very important way of reaching the general public. The politicians tend to speak to elite audiences too often. And musicians are a way of getting to the whole public, which matters in this world.
And if your Prime Minister can remember the words to the song, then, they can sort of,
But Virginia, in all seriousness, I think that there are few things that connect as directly to the soul as does a song. So there is something very powerful about a song.
I think I could prove it. My children listen to you, Missy, much more often than they'd listen to me.
And they listen to you.
And that's just as it should be, Grahame, I think. But before we move on, can you sing?
I can hold a tune.
Oh, can you?
But you won't find out tonight.
And Amanda Rishworth, you've just bailed out on this one, haven't you?
I cannot sing, and that would be really bad. But look, I have reflected on some of the songs that have just inspired me, and Kev Carmody's From Little Things, Big Things Grow still gives me shivers down my spine when I hear that. And I think in a lot of ways what songs can do is they can sum up a feeling, sum up a moment, which I'm not sure us politicians can.
Is there no Parliament House choir?
There is, actually.
There is there? Okay.
Yeah.
And you've not joined?
No, I'm not in it.
I think they're currently defunct.
I think it might be time to revive the Parliament House choir. Well, look, that's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our marvellous panel, Kenneth Roth, Mitch, Mr. Higgins, Grahame Morris and Amanda Rishworth. Thank you. Missy, that's your cue. All right, so Missy is going to head off to where she needs to be. You can continue the discussion with Q&A Extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Tracy Holmes is joined by Sasha Mola-Torres from New York University and the University of Technology at Sydney. Next Monday on Q&A, Labor's Assistant Treasury spokesman Andrew Lee, social researcher Jill Shepherd, who has identified 6 social classes in our supposedly classless nation, the Executive Director of the Institute for Public Affairs, John Roskin, and author, broadcaster and social analyst Rebecca Huntley. And Tony Jones better be here for that. We will leave you tonight with Missy Higgins performing 49 Candles from her latest album, Solastalgia. I'll be back on 7:30 tomorrow night, and Q&A, I'll be here sometime soon, I hope, as well. Good night.
Another one down, Another life lost, another night freedom comes at a cost. Another big story, another headline, another excuse for spinning more lies. But our voices, where do they go? We're calling out, but nothing follows. All our voices, where do they go? Where do they go? Our 49 candles burn in Orlando, in Orlando. Another new bullet, another gunfight, another mother is told her son has died. Another wall built, another point made, another excuse for living this way. But our voices, where do they go? We're shouting loud, but the sound is swallowed. All our voices, where do they go? Where do they go? While 49 candles burn, 49 candles burn, while 49 candles burn in Orlando, in Orlando. What's it gonna take? What's it gonna take? What's it gonna take? While 49 candles burn, you're never the same as you once were. While 49 candles burn in Orlando, in Orlando. 49 candles burn, and 49 souls will not return. While 49 candles burn in Orlando, in Orlando. What's it gonna take? What's it gonna take? What's it gonna take? 49 candles burn. 49 candles burn. While 49 candles burn in Orlando.